The law is keeping South Korea from aging by at least 1 year this year. This reality follows the National Assembly's approval of measures late last year to standardize the country's age counting system by surrendering the two traditional ways of calculating age. So what prompted the approval? And what were the two traditional ways of counting age? Also, what are the exceptions to the rule? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Starting today, Koreans are 1 year younger than they would have been under the Korean age counting system. For more on this, I have Professor Lee Hee-eun at Handong Global University live on the line. Professor Lee, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I also have Thomas Maresca here in the studio with me. Thomas, it's good to have you here.
Great to be here. Congratulations on losing
being younger.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that being said, Professor, let's begin with some background information behind the Yoon administration's decision to adopt the universal age counting system. I mean, simply speaking, why are we surrendering the Korean age counting system?
Well, because basically it's frankly very confusing for so many people outside of Korea. And, you know, the idea here was, according to the Yoon administration, when they were campaigning, the idea was, you know, there's a social cost associated with using the system, which is so different than other parts of the world. And so if you can unify basically the age system, then things will be much less confusing, especially for people coming into Korea or, you know, with respect to explaining things that are outside the Korean context. And so, for instance, you know, with respect to COVID, let's say vaccines, there was instructions on COVID regulations, COVID vaccines, let's say, for instance, that let's say for those, this vaccine is not good for people under the age of 30. And so many people here in Korea were asking, well, does that apply the Korean age system or does that apply the international global age system, right? So that's one example. A similar example with respect to PCR testing, you know, with respect to guidance, with respect to, let's say, people over 60. So again, question is it 60 from the Korean age system or from the international system? And so because of these discrepancies between the Korean age system and sort of the global or the international age system, the idea was to harmonize the two so that basically you could avoid confusion here in Korea, particularly when it comes to dealing with, let's say, products coming from overseas that have recommended ages.
Right, indeed. And before I ask you about your views on that, Professor Lee, I'm first going to turn to Thomas. Before we advance any further, could you, for the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with the three different methods of counting age here in the country, could you briefly tell us about them, Thomas?
Sure, yeah, it definitely is kind of confusing. I mean, the Korean age that I think people still generally most commonly use is calculated when you're born, you are 1 right off the bat, and then you add a year to your age on January 1st or on the new year. So, you know, you could be born on December 31st and the next day be already two years old after the clock changes. There's also, you know, the standard form is used in some cases where, you know, the international standard where you're just born and then your first birthday is 365 days later. And there's also a third one that's used in certain specific scenarios, which is takes your basic, you know, your standard international birth age, but then still also adds a year when, you know, the calendar turns to January 1st. And that's kind of used in calculating legal age for buying tobacco, cigarettes, I think, you know, academic context, starting school, a couple of other things like military conscription. So, you know, there are these three simultaneously happening. And, you know, so in certain contexts, you can be 20, 21, 22, you know, all at the same time.
Right, indeed. And Thomas, has the former Korean age counting system been a source of some confusion or perhaps even amusement for you while here in the country?
Yes, I mean, probably a little of both. I think probably my first experience of it, and it's something that still happens a lot, and I think maybe a lot of journalists have this experience, is if you're talking to somebody, maybe just interviewing somebody on the street, you ask them their name, their age, and it's so often it's this dance of Korean age, international age, and then even trying to figure out sometimes which one to use. And sometimes if you have an interpreter with you, it gets extra confusing, you know, so it often just devolves into, you know, what year they were born. So, I mean, it still happens. You know, I think I sort of lump it in with there's other things when you come to Korea, just in counting in general is kind of confusing and different. I mean, just there's two different number systems in Korean and, used for different things. And even sort of with big figures using 10,000 as a base for calculating things. So, there's that level of, it's confusion. I mean, it's interesting in a sense. It is an insight into a different way of doing things. I think, as we'll probably touch on as well, the longer you're here, you do realize that there's some significance to just how important age is within Korean society. So you start to pick up on that as you go along. But yeah, just in general, it's still even now is a kind of a dance about trying to figure out how old somebody is.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor, I understand there are some exceptions to the adoption of the international age counting system here in the country. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Right. So there's going to be some vestiges of the older system that's going to remain, and that's particularly in relationship to, let's say, buying alcohol and tobacco. And so when you are buying alcohol and tobacco, that will continue to use the old system. And in this context, you have to look to the Youth Protection Act, which is a law in Korea, which identifies, what is a juvenile. And a juvenile is anyone under the age of 19. And the question is, okay, when you calculate the age of 19, then 19 is when you are of the age of 19 during the January 1st, when the year changes. So if you're 19 at that point, then you can buy alcohol and tobacco. But also this rule also applies, the old system would also apply to military service as well. So those born in a particular year, they will all be eligible for military service beginning the first of that year of your age. And then also, lastly, most notably, will be school admissions. And so school admissions will continue to retain the age with respect to the age when you start school from the 1st of March. And let's say you turn age 6 in the international system, then you can enter school formally in terms of the public school education system. So despite the fact that we've moved on from the internet to the international age system, we will keep the older system in place for those three main areas.
Right. And also with regard to getting alcohol and tobacco, Professor, so technically speaking, even if you're born in December and the year changes, you're still eligible to drink alcohol or smoke if you are 19 in that particular year.
Yeah, that's right. And so they're trying to maintain consistency for those born within that calendar year.
Right, I see. And all that being said then, Professor, what are your personal thoughts regarding this change in age counting here in the country?
I think it depends on your perspective, right? So I know if I asked my kids what their ages are, they would prefer the Korean system just because they're going to be claimed to be older. And then, of course, as you get older in age, you will prefer probably the global standard. But, I kind of like the old system in some sense, even though it was a bit confusing because, when you're born, you sort of count, when you were in your mother's womb. But I can understand the confusion that it raises. And so it does make some sense, particularly now where Korea is now dealing with, everyone from around the world. Korea is clearly global, and having the two systems does, leave a lot of confusion to some degree. And so I see it makes a lot of sense to sort of make the change so that now there's some consistency and to avoid the confusion that the government sort of sees as, giving some social cost to people here to leading to this confusion. So I'm in favor of the change. And then I think, going forward, people will sort of get used to it as they go forward in regular conversation.
Right, hopefully. Thomas, Korea's decision to adopt the universal age counting system has made international headlines as well. What has been the gist of the foreign media coverage?
I think, it's generally, it's almost like the type of story that the headline is the story. It's kind of a quirky, it's more in that vein. It's just, you can say everyone in Korea today is becoming 1 or 2 years younger, and that's, more or less it. And, by the time you describe what the system is, maybe some of the path of the legislation that led to this point, what some of the exceptions are, you're already, that's a lot of the story. I think the local coverage, even some of the local English language versions of Korean publications, and I'm sure within the Korean media in general, there is more of a there's more depth to the investigation of what it means and sort of what the significance of it is. I mean, it's the sort of thing you can touch on maybe a bit as far as like some of the things we're talking about, the way that there's an age, the age hierarchy within Korea and how that sort of impacts things. Yeah, I think by the time you just get through sort of explaining it to an audience you assume is not going to be familiar with it, you've already written a good chunk of the story. Yeah, and I think there are interesting meanings and contexts around it that are worth exploring, and maybe longer form pieces can kind of touch on what age means in Korean society. And there's interesting, even today I read something where a professor was talking about some of these implications, like how does starting counting age at, say, inception or gestation affect people's thoughts about a topic like abortion? Like those sorts of kind of contextual issues are interesting, but I think you're going to see it locally. It's a lot to try to pack into international coverage. So generally, you just go for the quirky, grabby kind of angle, I think.
Right, indeed. As Professor, there are quite a number of people here who do believe that counting the months that you spend in a mother's womb is also as important as counting those that take place once you're born. And that being said, Professor, do you believe the tendency to define perhaps a person by his or her age is particularly strong here in South Korea?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, age has always been an important factor here in Korea, and as we all know, just in terms of our language, when we refer to people, it's very defined by the hierarchy that's established by age. And so we all know that, if you are older than somebody, and if you are, let's say, a boy or man, you would say hyung if someone's older, of course. And then if you're a woman or a girl, you would say oppa to an older person, or 언니, depending on if you're a woman, And so we have all these terms that are defined by age. And so even in other contexts, when we think about just people of the same age, as you're considered to be friends in the context of people who are the same age as you, as opposed to people who are, let's say, younger or older than you. So absolutely, given Korea's strong Confucian traditions, which is built in the language, it's going to have, of course, for Korean context, very important in terms of what age you are. And that's, of course, the reason why when you meet people for the first time, and I think some people, if you've lived in Korea long enough, you realize that when you do meet people, they are curious about how old you are. And they can establish sort of then how to speak to you and what's the proper way of addressing you, given your relative age difference. And so, yes, age it matters. It will continue to matter. It's built into our culture, built into our language. And so I think this is something which will remain for quite some time in the Korean context, especially given our history and our culture.
Right, of course. And also, speaking about age, Professor, but moving beyond our talk about the different methods of counting it, the Yoon administration has spoken about lowering the age of criminal responsibility here in South Korea. Speaking as a scholar in the field of law, Professor Lee, what are your thoughts regarding this matter?
Right. So the big question here is in law and in legal systems is the question about when can you be held responsible sort of as an adult? And we use the term the age of majority. And really that's the cutoff line between adulthood and being a child. And so currently in Korea, right, if you're a teenager in South Korea from the ages of 14 to 19, you're charged according to the Criminal Act or the Juvenile Act, depending on the nature of your crime. But if you are from the ages of 10 to 13, you cannot be charged using the Criminal Act. It has to be the Juvenile Act. And so, recently we've had a number of big, I think, issues in Korea where minors who are from the ages, from the age of 10 to 12 to 13, 14, they have committed some horrific crimes. And so there have been voices within Korean society and within the legal system to sort of lower the age of criminal responsibility to encompass those individuals who have committed horrendous crimes but wouldn't otherwise be treated and prosecuted under the Criminal Act. They only would be charged under the Juvenile Act. And so now the question is, people are saying, let's move the age to the age of 12, which is in some sense not unusual considering other countries in comparison. So there's been a lot of debate in this country as to lowering the age so that you can now encompass 12-year-olds who've committed horrible crimes of violence, for instance, or even instances of sexual violence as well, to now let them potentially be prosecuted under the Criminal Act in that setting. But there's been a lot of debate, and there's lots of reasons why you might not do that, because people have said, well, these are still kids. And despite the fact that they have committed these acts, there is the possibility that they don't realize exactly the consequences of their actions. And so you should give some room so that they won't be prosecuted in the same way. But then, of course, others will say, well, these crimes are just so horrendous that there has to be responsibility placed on these individuals, despite the fact that they are between at 12 years of age. So I think this debate is going on, and I think it will be decided, I think, in the context of this administration, because I think the administration would like to lower the age, I think, to the age of 12, to then apply these rules accordingly to these individuals.
And keeping that in mind, Professor Lee, speaking as a father and as a scholar, what do you personally think? Should we lower this age or not?
Yeah, it's a hard question, because I go back and forth on it, because I do realize, 12-year-olds, I mean, they are very immature, and many of them sort of don't understand necessarily maybe the consequences of their actions. But, age is relative, because, you certainly have some 12-year-olds that can be particularly very mature, right? So I think it's very hard, because the law is in such a way that has to be applied sort of objectively. And, it would be nice sort of do it on a case-by-case basis and sort of take in a psychological survey of the individual and then look at the circumstances to determine whether or not they should be charged. So I think, for me personally, I think it would depend, right, on the case-by-case situation. If the law were to be changed, then hopefully it will allow for this individualized case-by-case sort of approach, where then you can determine whether that 12-year-old really should be tried under the Criminal Act versus the Juvenile Act. So I'm in favor of it only insofar as if you can allow for this sort of case-by-case sort of basis by which you can evaluate the individual circumstances.
Right, I see. And Thomas, what can you share with us about the minimum age of criminal responsibility over in the US?
I would say the conversation or the debate is sort of framed going more in the other direction about calls to raise it. But the U.S., first of all, the U.S. is such a federalized system that every state is different. But in many states, 24 states, I believe is the latest number, have no minimum age of criminal responsibility at all. In others, the ages, some are 6, 7, several are 10. The U.S. is also already such a carceral society. There's so much of a prison population and criminal justice, policing action type of society that, there's been some really high profile scenes that have been caught on police, body cams and social media, where a 6-year-old girl in Orlando, Florida was arrested from her classroom for throwing a tantrum and put in zip ties and taken out. There was like a 9-year-old girl in upstate New York was pepper sprayed and thrown in a car. So, there's sites like that sort of have put a spotlight on this issue that in a lot of places there is no minimum age for criminal responsibility. And I think it sort of fits into a larger conversation about judicial or legal reform issues around just the U.S. system in general. There's definitely been a racial discrimination component that a lot of reform-minded figures have pointed out in the way that these arrests are unequally handed out, and I think reform-minded groups have looked at just advances in neuroscience to say that we can see more and more clearly that brains don't develop in a certain way to be able to really account for understanding or the kind of adult responsibility. And there's even beyond just minimum criminal responsibility age, there's also the age at which you can be tried as an adult, and that is also, there's a lot of conversations about trying to move that up so you don't have 16-year-olds and super serious, adult prisons. And, people often talk about just the trauma of a young person just being kind of brought into the penal system. There's a phrase, school to prison pipeline, where there's already this feeling that, and again, often targeting, minority groups as far as just schools. There are many armed police officers in schools, and it sort of creates this system that. So I think, a lot of states have already made changes. It's not happening overnight, but I would say that's more of the general tenor of the discussion. But we're starting really in a different place.
Right, I see. Moving forward, Professor Lee, starting last year, an 18-year-old Korean is eligible to run for a seat at the National Assembly or a provincial head position or even local council membership. Now, the age barrier was lowered as part of efforts to encourage interest in politics among the young here. Again, do you believe such efforts will indeed serve to boost political participation?
Well, I think it's bit questionable, because if we talk about voting, then possibly in terms of just generating interest among youth, because in Korea, the youth culture and the youth generally have, been basically very politically active. I think beginning even with pro-democracy movements in Korea, emanating from college campuses in the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, even till today, there has been a lot of efforts to sort of involve the youth, particularly on the voting end, but also in terms of just participating politically in the public process among civic organizations. But with respect to actual elections and being elected as an official, I think it's a much more challenging aspect to this in terms of being able to be involved in direct politics and being elected as an official at such a relatively young age. And that's because the culture of Korean politics, as we just thinking about just Korea in general, age certainly does matter. And so with respect to the political parties themselves, your hierarchy, your sort of rank, your connections, your relationships that are built over, many, many years, it comes with, age and your experience within the party and sort of maneuvering within the party process. And so being able to be actually put in front in terms of put up for an election by one of the major political parties is going to really require you to sort of get in sort of on the ground floor and then work yourself up and to build credibility with other party members and the party bosses, frankly, to then be able to then get a nod to get elected into office. But, if you're a very, entrepreneurial sort of candidate and sort of you want to run as an independent, possibly. I mean, we may see then, greater youth participation from the independent side if you're running sort of an election as an independent. But within the major political parties, I don't see this being particularly very, very strong in terms of being something that will actually attract more younger, for example, 18, 19-year-olds actually running for office and actually winning, because of, the huge amount of resources it takes, both on the political capital side, but also just even in terms of having money to raise for a campaign, I think is going to be really significant barrier. So I don't see it actually being really effective in terms of actually increasing the youth population to actually run for political office, given the, I think, really strong barriers to entry that exist within the Korean political system.
Right, I see. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Professor, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Thomas, here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Wednesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching.